Welcome to The Debate. When we think about stopping a speeding car, the absolute most immediate, foolproof solution is actually pretty simple. You just build a massive, immovable concrete wall.
Right? A solid concrete wall.
Exactly. The car hits the wall, and the forward motion ends instantaneously. It is violent, it is sudden, but it is undeniably effective at halting that kinetic energy.
It gets the job done in that one isolated second, sure.
Right. But here is the catch. If your ultimate goal isn't just to stop the car in that one specific moment, but rather, to teach the driver how to safely navigate a winding, treacherous mountain road for the rest of their life, well, suddenly that concrete wall isn't just unhelpful.
No, it's destructive.
It is actively destructive to the vehicle, to the driver, and to the entire process of learning how to drive.
Yeah, the immediate danger of the speed is neutralized. And from a purely functional standpoint, the adult in the room achieved their immediate goal. But at what cost to tomorrow? So today we are examining the fundamental mechanics of childhood discipline.
Yeah, we're looking at a central question drawn from the source material. Does effective discipline require the complete abandonment of punitive control in favor of teaching understanding?
Or is the recommendation to, set clear boundaries and explain consequences fundamentally just a more sophisticated, maybe calmer form of behavioral control?
I represent the perspective that true discipline is fundamentally distinct from intimidation. To actually work, it must rely entirely on fostering genuine understanding and prioritizing long-term emotional health over short-term compliance.
And I take the perspective that the prescribed boundaries and consequences still inevitably rely on a degree of behavioral control, making the dividing line between punishment and discipline far more complex than a simple binary.
Okay, let's draw the battle lines here. When I look at the underlying research and the core philosophy we are analyzing, I see an undeniable, bright line drawn between threats and true discipline.
A bright line? Really?
Yes, a bright line. The ultimate thesis is laid out beautifully. The goal of parenting is not to raise obedient children, it is to raise responsible, confident, and emotionally healthy adults. That is our North Star.
Sure, I agree with the North Star.
Right, and if we evaluate our methods against that goal, relying on threats, things like saying, I won't love you, or I'll throw away all your toys, that guarantees the exact opposite outcome. The analysis shows us these tactics result in anxiety, insecurity, and a total loss of trust.
Well, yeah, those are extreme examples, though.
But let's look at the why behind that. When a child is threatened with, I won't love you, their amygdala completely hijacks their brain. They are literally neurologically incapable of processing the logical lesson you were trying to teach about sharing a toy.
Because they're in panic mode.
Exactly. They are operating out of a primal fear of abandonment. They aren't developing self-control, they are just developing survival mechanisms to appease a threatening giant. So real discipline requires entirely divorcing correction from fear. We have to move purely into the realm of guidance.
I come at it from a different way. I absolutely agree that extreme, emotionally manipulative threats, like threatening a child's secure attachment by saying, I won't love you, that damages trust.
It destroys it.
Right. It is undeniable emotional manipulation, and it triggers exactly the neurological panic you just described. But we have to look closely at the practical reality acknowledged in the material itself.
Which is?
It admits a crucial fact. Punishment may stop behavior temporarily. The proposed better approach is to set clear boundaries and explain consequences calmly.
Yes, exactly.
But my argument is that this better approach is, in practice, essentially a sanitized form of punishment. Imposing a negative consequence, even if you do it with a perfectly calm voice, a gentle smile, and a clear explanation, it inherently introduces a form of behavioral control.
I just don't think it's the same thing at all.
You are still modifying their behavior by making them suffer a negative outcome. It simply removes the emotional volatility of an overt screaming threat, but the underlying architectural foundation remains exactly the same. It relies on the child's desire to avoid that negative outcome.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. To me, the mechanism of how the behavior is stopped changes the entire nature of the interaction.
How so?
Let's ground this. If you're a parent listening to this, you're probably thinking, well, that is great in theory, but when my kid is throwing a tantrum in the grocery store and hurling cereal boxes at my head, I do not have time for a philosophical discussion.
Exactly. You need them to stop immediately.
Right. But the literature warns against creating fear-based behavior instead of self-control. This is where the hostage versus physics analogy becomes vital.
I'm listening.
Relying on threats and punishments is essentially like creating a hostage situation. If you tell a child, if you throw that cereal again, I am leaving you in this aisle forever.
Wow, harsh.
Right, but people do it. The child's compliance is forced by the imminent danger of abandonment. The parent is the aggressor holding a manufactured consequence over their head.
Okay.
But a natural consequence, or a truly logical consequence explained calmly, operates more like the law of physics. If you touch a hot stove, you get a burn. The stove isn't punishing you.
No, it's just hot.
Right, the stove isn't angry. The consequence teaches a lesson objectively about the nature of reality. When we help children understand the consequences of their actions, we are pushing toward the physics model and away from the hostage model. The cognitive load of fear prevents comprehension. I mean, how can any true learning happen when a child is paralyzed by anxiety?
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are separating the hostage situation and the physics situation as if they do not share the exact same underlying mechanism.
They don't.
They absolutely do. It's the avoidance of pain or loss. Yes, the hot stove is objective, and it doesn't scream at you. But the child stops touching it because they fear the physical burn.
That's a natural physical instinct, not a manufactured emotional fear.
But before a child can learn why a behavior is wrong, before we can get to that high-level comprehension and personal responsibility you were talking about, the dangerous or unacceptable behavior must first be halted.
I agree it has to be halted, sure.
Let's go back to your grocery store example. If a parent sets a clear boundary and backs it up with a consequence, say, if you throw the cereal, we are leaving the store and you don't get your screen time tonight.
Okay.
That system still relies entirely on the child's calculation to avoid a negative outcome. They think, I want to throw this box, but the loss of my iPad is worse, so I will stop. That is, by definition, a rationalized form of fear.
But the research explicitly contrasts fear-based behavior with self-control. If the consequence is just another form of fear, as you suggest, then setting a calm boundary wouldn't lead to self-control either.
Why not?
It would just lead to a slightly quieter hostage situation.
It leads to self-control because the fear is predictable and proportional rather than volatile and existential. When you threaten, I won't love you, that is existential terror to a mammalian brain.
It equals death.
Exactly. It equals death to them. But when you say if you throw the toy goes in the closet for an hour, you are still controlling behavior through deprivation, but the stakes are manageable.
It's still deprivation.
But it allows the prefrontal cortex to stay online and calculate risk. It is a highly structured, vastly healthier form of behavioral control, but it is still fundamentally behavioral control. To pretend we have completely abandoned the mechanics of punishment just because we lowered our voices is to ignore the reality of what a consequence actually is in practice.
But look at what that sanitized punishment actually does to the child internally over time. Let's dig into the psychological impact here.
Sure.
The data specifically links punishment to low confidence, feelings of shame, and emotional withdrawal. It outlines how, under a punitive system, children begin to believe they are bad rather than understanding that their behavior was wrong.
This is about the fundamental formation of identity. If your system of boundaries and consequences relies purely on deprivation and rationalized fear, like taking away the iPad or the toy, you are constantly walking right up to the edge of attacking the child's identity. You are teaching them that their worth, or at least their comfort, is entirely conditional on their compliance.
I agree that attacking identity is destructive, but you are skipping right over a vital qualifier in the research. The material does not say all consequences automatically destroy self-esteem.
It strongly implies the risk is incredibly high. It specifically notes that when punishment is too harsh or frequent, children begin to believe they are bad. That phrase, too harsh or frequent, is doing a massive amount of structural work in this argument.
How so?
It establishes that there is a threshold. You don't destroy a child's identity with a reasonable boundary.
You honestly believe that threshold can be safely maintained while still using punitive consequences day in and day out?
The underlying logic demands it. By stating that the psychological damage occurs when punishment is too harsh or too frequent, it logically allows for the existence of correction that is not too harsh or frequent.
I mean, that's a generous reading of the text.
Setting a firm boundary with a strict, enforced consequence doesn't automatically equate to attacking the child's character, provided it doesn't cross that threshold of excess. The difference between shame and guilt is crucial here.
Okay, explain that distinction in this context.
Shame is, I am bad. Guilt is, I did a bad thing. You can absolutely impose a negative consequence that triggers healthy guilt without inducing toxic shame.
I don't know. A society has laws and penalties, right? Paying a speeding ticket doesn't make you feel fundamentally unlovable. It just makes you realize you broke a boundary and you have to pay a cost.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Because I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. The risk of crossing that threshold is simply too high, and frankly unnecessary if we follow the true intent of understanding-based guidance.
Unnecessary?
Yes. Think about how a child's brain processes deprivation. When a parent takes away a privilege, the child's mental energy doesn't automatically go toward reflecting on their poor choices.
Well, eventually it might. No, their mental energy is almost entirely consumed by managing their frustration, their perceived injustice, and their resentment toward the parent holding the power.
That's just a temporary reaction.
They aren't thinking about the behavior, they are thinking about your power over them. Any system that relies on imposing negative measures, even ones you try to calibrate perfectly to avoid being too harsh, inevitably risks making the child feel alienated. And that entirely undercuts the mandate to raise confident adults. True discipline that focuses purely on the why of the behavior, exploring the natural impacts of their actions on others, it removes that risk entirely.
But removing the consequence entirely effectively removes the boundary. If a child misbehaves and the only response is a purely intellectual conversation about why it was wrong without any enforced consequence, you aren't providing the guidance and consistency required for development.
Guidance is a conversation.
Consistency requires enforcement, and enforcement, especially when a child desperately wants to do something dangerous or antisocial, requires a boundary they cannot cross without facing a consequence they do not like.
So we're back to forcing them.
Bringing it back to your analogy at the top of the show, a boundary isn't a violent concrete wall. It's a guardrail on that winding mountain road. It stops you from going off the cliff.
Guardrails can still damage the car.
Yes, hitting a guardrail might scratch the paint on the car, and it might be unpleasant, but it is a necessary structural reality to keep the driver safe until they learn the route. That isn't shame, that is reality.
It only feels like reality if we assume the child is an adversary who must be managed and contained, rather than a learner who naturally wants to succeed and just lacks the skills.
I'm not saying they're an adversary.
And if we rely on the friction of that guardrail today, we are borrowing heavily against our future relationship with them. Let's fast forward a bit.
Okay.
What happens when that child turns 16 and they are driving their own car and you can no longer act as the physical guardrail? The research gives us a stark warning about this long-term trajectory.
Right, about rebellion.
It outlines that as children grow older, excessive control often leads to resistance and defiance. The impacts are severe. Anger toward parents, secretive behavior, and a fundamentally damaged parent-child relationship.
Which is a tragic but very common developmental trajectory when parents refuse to adapt their methods and try to treat a 17-year-old like a 7-year-old.
Exactly. And the antidote provided is to build cooperation through communication and mutual respect. The premise is that respect is stronger than fear.
I agree with that part.
My argument is that substituting fear with respect is the only empirically sound way to build long-term cooperation. If you have spent their entire childhood relying on your version of calm consequences, which you admit is just a softer form of behavioral control.
A structured form, yes.
What happens when they are a teenager? You no longer have the logistical power to enforce those consequences.
They are bigger than you, they have their own money, their own cars, your control simply evaporates.
Well, you still have some leverage.
But if you have spent their childhood building trust and understanding, exploring the why rather than enforcing the what, that respect holds the relationship together. Teenagers who respect their parents are vastly more likely to listen and cooperate than those who simply fear punishment.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered how a teenager actually perceives those consistent boundaries, regardless of how calmly you enforce them?
They perceive them better than arbitrary punishments.
I agree entirely that building cooperation through mutual respect is the ideal state. And I agree that excessive control leads to rebellion. But you are assuming that excessive control is exclusively tied to the overt, harsh punishments like the screaming threats we discussed earlier.
Because the progression in the behavioral data links the two concepts structurally. It moves directly from a history of harsh punishment to the resulting rebellion caused by excessive control.
Yes, but look at the recommended approach to build that respect. We are told to create a home environment based on trust, guidance, and consistency.
Right? Consistency.
Consistency inherently requires enforcing boundaries. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a 16-year-old. If a parent is rigorously enforcing a consistent boundary, let's say an 11 p.m. curfew.
Okay, a standard boundary.
Even if the parent does it calmly, even if they explain the neurological reasons why teenagers need sleep, and even if they explain the logical consequences perfectly.
Yeah.
If that teenager fundamentally disagrees with the curfew, they are still going to perceive it as excessive control.
Are you saying the recommended respectful approach inevitably causes the same rebellion?
I'm saying the implementation of any boundary can feel like a concrete wall to the person being bounded. If you enforce a strict curfew, calmly explain the consequences of breaking it, and then actually enforce a penalty when they break it, like taking the car keys for the weekend.
Right.
That teenager is still going to develop anger in that moment. They might still engage in secretive behavior to circumvent the curfew next time. Even a guardrail feels like a cage if you desperately want to drive off the cliff.
That's a bit fatalistic.
You cannot completely engineer out the resistance and the friction of control just by speaking calmly and using the word consequence instead of punishment. A teenager who loses their car keys because they broke a calm, pre-explained boundary is still going to feel the sting of behavioral control, and they will push back against it.
They will push back, absolutely. Adolescence is entirely about pushing boundaries, but the fundamental difference is in the bedrock of trust that has been established over the preceding 15 years.
The trust is still tested, though.
If the home environment is genuinely based on trust and guidance, the teenager might be furious about losing the keys on a Friday night, but they won't suffer a fundamental loss of trust in the parents. They won't experience anxiety and insecurity about the relationship itself.
That's fair.
The underlying mechanism of their eventual cooperation isn't a desperate attempt to avoid an emotionally devastating punishment. It's a deep-seated, perhaps begrudging, respect for the parent's guidance.
Begrudging is definitely the key word there.
I'll admit, relying entirely on respect is a terrifying leap of faith for a parent, because you have to give up the illusion of immediate dictatorial control. But that is exactly why abandoning fear-based tactics to foster true understanding is the only path. The intimidation merely halts the behavior in the moment. The thoughtful guidance is what actually shapes the character.
And I maintain that while emotional volatility and harsh threats are undeniably destructive to the child's identity, the architectural foundation of discipline still requires behavioral boundaries that have actual teeth.
Teeth.
Yes, peace. The distinction between a calm, logical consequence and a punishment is much narrower in practice than it is in theory. You are still imposing a negative outcome to modify their behavior, and that friction is a necessary part to preparing them for a world that will absolutely enforce consequences on them.
Well, as we wrap up this exploration, it's quite clear that we share significant areas of convergence, even if our core approaches remain distinct. We are in absolute, unequivocal agreement regarding the destructiveness of attacking a child's character.
Oh, 100%.
Using emotional manipulation to induce fear, threatening their secure attachment creates profound, lasting damage, anxiety, and toxic shame.
Completely. There is absolutely no defense from methods that induce a fundamental belief in a child that they are unlovable or bad. The evidence is overwhelming that excessive punishment destroys confidence and leads directly to emotional withdrawal.
Right.
Where we remain in substantive disagreement is on the exact mechanics of what replaces that harshness. You view these recommended consequences as a total departure from behavioral control, moving purely into education and physics.
I do.
And I view those exact same consequences as a highly refined, structurally necessary form of behavioral control that still relies on the child experiencing the friction of a negative boundary.
It is incredibly illuminating to break apart the definitions of discipline and control in this way, navigating this complex balance between setting the boundaries required to keep them safe today and building the deep trust required to keep them close tomorrow is arguably the most nuanced endeavor any adult can undertake.
It really is.
There is so much more to explore in the mechanics of how understanding truly shapes a developing brain. We invite you to further explore the perspectives we've discussed today to form your own conclusions. Because at the end of the day, when you are standing on that winding mountain road, deciding between building a concrete wall or acting as a trusted navigation system, might just shape a child's entire future.